All right, we're now live on YouTube and we'll start in about a minute. All right, welcome everyone. So a quick note before we start. I would like to request that all of you, if you can, if you're able, turn your videos on. During the icebreaker sessions, we discussed it with Dana, and it's really hard to give a lecture to a bunch of black screens with names. This is an interactive event. It's going to be a discussion. We'd love it if you're able to, please turn them on and keep them on. We'd like to see your faces. And see your reactions. And later during the discussion, we really like this event to be very participatory. This is also being streamed live on YouTube. You can get the link in the little drop down on the top left and share with anyone who would like to join. So my name's Aisha. My pronouns are she and her. I am a second year MArch student at the GAUD. I'm from Pakistan, and I'm really interested in the intersection between activism and architecture. It's really great that our theme this semester is empowerment. It's really exciting. I also work with Gaude, which is the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion group that's co-sponsoring this event. I, along with Michelle, who will introduce herself in a second, are going to be your moderators for tonight. And Michelle will introduce Dana, and also will after the lecture, introduce you to our panelists with whom we'll be having this great discussion. So Pratt Futures is a really great student-led organization that brings young professionals to speak to us about their experiences during school and professionally. It's really valuable because it's exactly about where we are and where we're about to go. And it also brings the undergraduate and graduate wings of the School of Architecture together, which, as we've seen from the town hall today, the Equitable Town Hall, which I think I saw a lot of you there, so thank you for that. It's something that we're all working towards, and I think that's really great. So I'm gonna, with that, hand it over to Michelle to introduce herself and to introduce Dana. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aisha. Thanks everyone for being here. And a big thank you to our guest, Dana McKinney, for coming to this. My name is Michelle. I'm a fourth year undergrad student here at Pratt. My pronouns are she, they. And with great pleasure, please allow me to introduce Dana McKinney, an urban planner, architect, and activist. She graduated from Princeton at the top of her class with a Bachelor of Architecture, and then completed her master's in architecture and urban planning, both with distinction at Harvard. And at her time at Harvard, she established the inaugural Black in Design Conference, Map the Gap, and the African American Design Nexus. And through both her academic and professional work, she centralizes people and their broader communities. So just let me know if Dana, if you have everything good to go, if you have access to share.
Okay, let me try. The question is, can you see anything yet? Okay, let's see. Okay, now do you guys see it as full screen, like bright lime green?
Yes, full screen.
Okay, cool. Hi everyone, I'm Dana McKinney, and as they said, I am an architect and urban planner. I also like to think of myself as an activist. I work at Gary Partners in Los Angeles, but I'm actually spending my work from home time on the East Coast. Right now I'm currently in New York City. And today I want to kind of talk to you guys a bit about the arc of my career, even though it's quite fresh, through academics all the way through where I am currently, and kind of show you guys how I've managed to some degree, interweave some of my personal values with the work I've done extracurricularly through the projects I was working on in school and in sort of the professional work I'm engaging right now. So with that being said, I'm going to begin. Let's see. So before I tell you too much, I do want to give you a little bit of a backstory about my own personal history and why I came into architecture. I'm actually from a small town in Connecticut called Trumbull. It's very white, upper middle class. Think Gilmore Girls, it's a little bit like that. But I spent a lot of my time growing up in Newark, New Jersey, which is about 9 miles outside of Manhattan, where my grandparents lived. This is the city that my mother grew up in. She's the little one right next to the stroller. And the reason why this city was so valuable in my upbringing was that I would go back and forth from my grandparents' house, which was like a modest middle class house in the city of Newark, to my parents' home in upper middle class Trumbull, Connecticut. But to get to my grandparents' home on Sundays after church for dinner, we had to drive through neighborhoods that looked like this. And from a really young age, kind of seeing that on a weekly basis, it really started to shape my opinions of what urban spaces were, what architecture was, and sort of the discrepancies between income, race, and other sorts of social factors as they relate to the urban environment. Just for reference, this is a affordable housing project in the city of Newark, where the exit of their fence is actually padlocked, and that there was only one entrance and exit, which I feel like is a fire hazard if I had to guess, but that's what it looks like in a lot of communities. A lot of homes that are in disrepair or have experienced fire, a ton of garbage on the street. It's very much not in great shape. A lot of, again, graffiti, boarded up windows, broken windows. And that led me to the GSD ultimately. I think you guys might be able to point me out in this picture. I was the only Black student of my graduating class. This wasn't even the complete class. These are just the people who showed up to graduation. So out of about 140 people from the MArch program in 2017, there was one Black person and one Latinx person. And for me, this really shaped some of the not just my day-to-day life, not just my studio experience, it shaped everything in that time that I was there. Because I was a concurrent degree student, I was there for 4.5 years, which is quite a bit of time, in addition to having already done 4 years of undergrad. And so I realized very early on that if I wasn't exactly satisfied with my place in the school, that it was important for me to become active and change that. So that leads me to my first part of my presentation on student activism. And so it was really important for me as the one Black student to reconcile what it meant to be the one Black student at a very predominantly white. Also, there was a larger international contingency from Asia, but a predominantly white environment, very white curriculum, just very white all around. And what I noticed among myself and other students of color was that the Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color were very much feeling disenfranchised within the school, feeling like they were a threat by other students, hearing sort of passive aggressive comments from faculty. To say the least, it wasn't an easy place. Even going between my white upbringing in Connecticut and Black Newark, New Jersey, it was perhaps the first time I was really made well aware of my race, in which I felt like it was being weaponized against me at times. And so there's a little story that happened pretty early into my experience there. We had, in the early days, formed an African-American Student Union, which had about 6 or 7 people in our first year, which was all 6 or 7 Black students at the GSD at the time out of 900 students. The following year, we actually had listened to a BBC podcast that Kanye West had been interviewed on, and he had a big rant about how he wanted to be an architect and architect the world and be a designer. So we thought, hey, let's write him a letter. Let's see what happens. Ultimately, a few months later, we get a call from his publicist saying he'll be available on Sunday night this November. Like, we need cookies and San Pellegrino water and a room so you guys have a 2-hour meeting to talk to him. In that meeting, we had about a 3-hour conversation, which then kind of took off in a different direction. He asked to do a tour of the school after the meeting and then announced to the entire GSD, "You're all going to my concert tonight for free." As a result of that concert, it was a Sunday night again, the day before midterm reviews for that week for the entire school. So it landed myself and a few others in the dean's office like we were in high school. And that led the beginning of a relationship, a long-standing relationship I've had since with the previous dean at the school, in part because we were in trouble for not informing them at the time, but it also really helped to put forward ideas of the experience of Black students at the school that was predominantly white, and things that we felt like were missing in our curriculum, in our day-to-day experience, and our extracurricular life. And so with that event and a series of press releases and interviews with the school, we actually had a pretty significant uptick of Black and Brown applications. And so that year we had maybe 10 to 12 Black students. The following spring, we ended up accepting another 20. So we had about 25 in the following year in 2014. With that uptick, it kind of gave attention to the school, and the school paid more attention to the Black students, and we got increased funding for the African American Student Union. And we approached them about doing more programming, seeing that there was a gap in terms of issues of people of color. So one of the first things we did was Map the Gap, which was a hackathon to look at incidents of police brutality that led into fatalities of people. So example, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, and look at the sort of geospatial as well as sociological, economic factors that were surrounding those different incidents of police brutality. That then kind of helped us to do a symposium called Informing Justice, where we asked a bunch of different practitioners and academics to come into the school and talk about their work as it relates to race and space. And then that spring, we did an installation, a Black Lives Matter installation. We were doing all these events, but we felt like as a student body, we still weren't being heard by the rest of the student body. And so at the time of which the non-indictment came out for the person who killed Mike Brown, I remember a bunch of us, of the Black students and brown students, literally standing behind me at my desk, all of us crying. And it was about almost time for finals. We were really distracted based off of what was going on outside of the school's walls. We were going to Black Lives Matter protests, laying in the streets during die-ins. And we felt that other students and faculty and administrators weren't paying enough attention. So we actually did an installation where we hung 100 faces, not identified by name, but how they died, where they died, and the date that they died, between between Mike Brown and Freddie Gray. And that was only 100 out of about 700 people that had been killed by police that year, but it got a lot of attention. There's a lot of pushback from other students, a lot of support. The school ended up helping us to do sort of inauguration for the piece. We had a ceremony, we had people come and sing, we had people come give testimonies about their own concerns. It also resulted in a school-wide town hall to talk about how students don't just live in the vacuum of the school itself, but are affected by the things that are going on in the geopolitical space outside of the school. We actually then took the installation and hung it up in other parts of Harvard, where we did an event with the music school and hung them up in one of their performance spaces, and they improv'd and played music to the actual pieces as a sort of memorial to the people who had been killed. And all these things kind of worked up and built up to give the 25 Black students or so a little bit more credibility within the school. Again, we're still like 25, 30 kids out of 900, which is not great, but better than the original 6 or 7. So another view of that, what that looked like, and literally hung all the way across from one end of the building to the other. It was interesting at first. We had started printing them on our own dime, and very quickly after 10, it was like, ooh, we're gonna have to figure out some financing for this. So we talked to one of the deans of students, and they actually agreed to help finance the rest of the printing costs, which was really, I think, a great statement on their part as an administration in support of our sort of pains that we were experiencing at the time. And all these different events led up to Black in Design. I should also go back a little bit and say, after that initial meeting with Kanye West, we actually approached the dean about doing a conference. And again, this is where like 10, 11, 12 kids. He was just like, no. You can have a lecture, you can have a symposium, you can have a luncheon. You don't need to have a conference. And we said, just you wait, we're going to put together a conference. After we put together about $50,000 in financing, we were then able to have a conference which oversold out 600 tickets, called Black in Design. It was the first of its kind. There's already the National Organization of Minority Architects. There's their conference, but it's much more professionally oriented. Black in Design was intended to be student oriented, also young professionals. And we were looking at ways to celebrate the contributions of Black designers, not just as the traditional fields of architecture, landscape, urban planning, urban design, but looking also at musicians, fashion artists, car designers, people who are in industrial design. We wanted to have an opportunity over a few days to actually showcase their work and not feel the same sort of restrictions you might feel in a traditional academic conference or in a professional conference. Black in Design was so successful, the university committed to doing the conference every other year. We would have loved to do it annually, but essentially 10 students full-time planned this conference in addition to their other academic work and all these other initiatives we were doing on the side. So we agreed to do every other year. In October 2017, they had another one, again, sold out. This is just an image from the last day. Initially, the first one was 2 days, the second one was 3. And then as of not this fall, last fall, obviously, just around this time of the year, we had the Black Futurism Conference for Black in Design. And so one thing that we worked with the newer students is that we want to make sure the conference is continuing to address their needs as students. Like, I'm out of school now for almost 4 years. Like, I can't dictate to you what your interests are. And so we found out the students at that time were super interested in like Black Panther had just come out and all this Afrofuturistic comic books and art was really prevalent at the time. And so that was the thing that they really wanted to focus on. And then they just compiled 30, 40 people to come and showcase work of Black futurism. And so right now, Black in Design 2021 is being planned for next fall. The other thing that came out of the work of the African American Student Union was the African American Design Nexus. While we were really excited to celebrate the work through the conference, we wanted to find a way to inject Black voices more institutionally within the university. And so we posed to the dean, as well as one of the librarians, like, we want an archive. We want to have models, drawings, we want photographs of Black designers' work in this school that we can have access to. And so with that, we started assembling a list of Black designers, starting using an existing repository of architects, and then expanding it again to this sort of broad sweeping definition of architects. And so the original architecture list was about 2,000 names, and we've since probably added up 3,000 names to that. So my next thing I want to talk to you guys about is my thesis called Societal Simulations. And this kind of goes back to people who are system impacted or system impacted person. This is a broader term for people who are affected by this system of incarceration or probation or parole. Typically, when we talk about the criminal justice system, we think of jails, prison, probation, parole, maybe, and then we think about people as being incarcerated. Very rarely do we talk about people who are affected by the system at large. What we see, especially now, is that people, like women, when they go in, it especially undercuts their entire families. And so it was really important to start looking at it from a broader spectrum of everybody in the sort of ecosystem that's involved. I'm just going to give you like a 30-second overview of incarceration through the design lens. Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon came out in 1791. It was initially intended to be a theory of surveillance, and then it got sort of deployed across different spectrums of programming, of which one was the prison. Auburn Prison in 1818 was based off of retribution. So the idea that you are bad, you're morally reprehensible, and therefore you deserve punishment. Similarly, in the same time frame, 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary was looking at rehabilitation through the lens of solitary confinement, which is a little bit bad. Solitary confinement, as we know right now, doesn't really have significantly great outcomes. In fact, it actually tends to make people's mental health conditions worse, their physical health worse, etc. Today, there's now more than 7.3 million people that are are system impacted, specifically those who are incarcerated in jails and prisons, as well as community supervision, which is probation and parole. This is an example of what this is a state prison in California would look like that might be dealing with the issue of overcrowding. But a more traditional jail cell would be a single room, which is about 5 by 8 feet. The windows in this is actually kind of luxurious. A lot of the state prisons use a 3-inch by maybe a 24-inch window that might have wire mesh embedded in the glass. So you can't actually see out. They also don't tend to improve the glass very often. And so there's a lot of times you'll see like scratches on them. So you literally, it's just kind of a translucent viewport to nothing. In terms of the growth of the prison population, it skyrocketed following a series of policy initiatives by the federal government, some of which stemmed from the war on crime, the war on drugs, sentencing reform acts, as well as 3 strikes policies. And so in the 1990s through the early 2000s, that's where you really start to see a significant peak of the population. The majority of people that are incarcerated are in state prisons. There's a small percentage of juveniles, and these numbers are from 2015. So the juveniles number is 68,000. That's the only population that has declined significantly across the criminal justice world. There's been a kind of a reckoning with the fact that juveniles shouldn't be incarcerated, that their outcomes are never really great after the fact. And so a lot of states especially have gone through the efforts to actually decarcerate their juvenile facilities. A fun, not so fun fact, the state of Connecticut has now about 41 kids that are incarcerated. They've closed all but 1 facility, and the cost to keep those kids, each of them in that facility for an annual basis is $1.1 million per child. 41 kids, $1.1 million per child. So it's an incredible expense to keep people incarcerated. On average, it's not that much for adults, but it is quite costly. There's like a running joke in the advocate world that like it's cost more to send someone to state prison than the state college, and normally it's by 2-fold. In terms of lifetime likelihood of being incarcerated, Black men and women are most disproportionately represented in prisons and jails. It's also noteworthy to know that Black women are the only population that have been rising in the last 10 years. Every other population is slowly starting to decrease, but the incarceration of Black women is skyrocketing currently. This is a concern, especially as you're talking about social welfare of families, in terms of kids. Imagine now with COVID, what that could mean for a family when their mom has been incarcerated. And so it's important to look at intersectionality and not just by race or by gender. Okay, so the annual cost of mass incarceration in the country is $80 billion. I'm just kind of giving you guys some numbers to latch onto. $80 billion is pretty significant, I think. Point of reference, the entire county of LA's annual budget is about $30 billion. So, 2.5 LA counties worth of people. And just some examples of what jails are not, or what they could be in a better way. This is Halden Prison. It's in Halden, Norway. It's a maximum security facility. It is kind of the Rolls Royce of prisons to some degree. It doesn't look like much from the plan, but when you go inside the facility, it is like this Norwegian, like forest college campus all mixed together, and it's beautiful. The way that they've modeled this particular facility is sort of on dorm room styles. Everybody lives in units of 10 people. No one is called an inmate or a prisoner. Everybody is a client. Everybody has their own dorm room with their own bathroom. You are encouraged from the first day you step on the campus to actually kind of create a plan for how you're going to get out. The thing about Norway is that they have a 21-year maximum sentence, whereas in America, you can have multiple life sentences. And so in the sort of Scandinavian culture, it's extremely important to look at people as being rehabilitated, as being able to be rehabilitated and as able to move forward. They look at incarceration as a failure of society onto a person, not as a person's failure onto society. This facility I actually went to last year. It was pretty awesome to see, like, they have a ceramic shop and a podcast studio. They have one client who's in there right now, and he's working on his PhD. They basically say that if you want something, they will bring those resources to you. They acknowledge that it's expensive, but it's a long-term investment because those people have been historically divested and not really, the investment haven't been made in those people in the first place. Astoy minimum security prison, so also Norway. It was formerly a boys' summer camp, an island. And their thought is everybody can live in a cabin of their choosing. There's a farm on the site. You can do woodworking. You can continue to do education, so you choose. There are no gates. There are no fences. It is all open. And the idea is that you're not going to swim, so you're not going to escape. And if they do, kudos. Not really, but so that was that one. And then Grand Valley Institute for Women is in Ontario. This is an amazing model for women specifically, and it looks at doing duplex housing all around the sort of centralized courtyard where you can bring your family with you to prison. It sounds crazy, but the outcomes of this facility have been amazing, especially for kids. Instead of kind of taking the mom out of the household, you as a household go. There's schools right in the area. The sense of gates and the fences is very different than what you would normally think of for a prison. And there's a lot of flexibility for moms to continue to parent without having to be disjointed from their families. And so when I was looking at this, this was my thesis. So it was sort of the pinnacle of my experience at the school. And I really wanted it to feel heartfelt and look at a model that was a little different from like the Scandinavian model or the Ontario model, definitely different from what we had, and not necessarily incarceration. And I want to go back to Newark. So Newark has had a huge legacy of incarceration, which stems from an issue of racism and segregation, among other issues. When the city was first founded, it was highly segregated, filled with immigrants from all over from Europe as well as Asia. The segregation was further reinforced with redlining in the 30s. And then in 1967, there was a race riot that lasted 3 days long. It basically undercut the entire city, and there was a significant rise of white flight immediately after that, in conjunction with a few other federal policies like the Federal Highway Act that cut through the city. Basically, it undercut the economy of the city of Newark and left a predominantly Black and brown population. Today, 1 in 4 residents have a lifetime likelihood of going to prison. So let that sit up for a second. 1 in 4 lifetime likelihood of going to prison. This number, when I saw it, it's something interesting because I could see it when you look at the city and you see people and you hear about people like, oh, where'd your uncle go? Oh, they're locked up. Or where is this person? You know, they're back up north. And so, but to actually read that statistic and put it to paper, I think was really impactful for me as I move forward in the project. And then the cost to actually send somebody to a state penitentiary is about $55,000 a year. So I want to create a village model, which was looking at a place of restoration. So not just rehabilitation, but restoration. So actually uplifting and empowering people to move forward in their lives following their sentence. This is Baxter Terrace, this orange site. And it was formerly the site of the first public housing project in the city of Newark. It was built in 1941, but like a lot of public housing at the time, it fell quickly into disrepair because there wasn't a lot of maintenance going on. And in the early 2000s, they ended up having to tear it down because of issues of prostitution and drugs happening on site. What I want to actually put forth on this site is a 3-part model. One of rehabilitation, looking at restorative justice, which I'll explain in a minute, security through housing, and empowerment through activities and employment. Because we're architects and designers, I just want to throw out a few drawings. Just a ground floor plan of the site's organization. I don't envision this thing to be like capital A architecture that is going to stand out. I don't want it to stand out. A lot of times when you're working with system impacted families, there is a lot of fear of being stigmatized. So it was really important to me that this thing kind of blended in with the existing urban fabric. It was also important to sort of utilize a traditional mixed-use urban model, so ground floor retail with upper floors of residential. But once you got inside the site, that's when the architecture started to kind of erode and create its own typology of space. One thing I did was I wanted to look at employment opportunities for people that wouldn't be discriminatory for them. Like the entire thing about this site is I want people to be empowered. So I did a search on all these different companies that would accept people who have felony offenses on their record. When you are applying for a job, many of you will be doing this coming few months, you'll see that little checkbox like, yes, I committed a felony offense. For most people, when you check that box, it is a complete eliminating factor for getting a job. And so it was incredibly important to find organizations and companies that don't have that box, which surprisingly, many corporations are now starting to take that box off. Frozen. And then looking at the residential plan, one of the things I didn't, you're not going to see that today, but I actually designed about 30 different unit typologies, looking at different family structures from people who are coming out of prison and might live alone, and they might want to do co-living, but they might also want to do single room occupancy, to a father and a mom and a kid. Okay, we might have multi-generational to have mom, dad, grandpa, and kids. We might have cross-generational households. And so to create different typologies that are able to absorb people and the sort of quirkiness of their individual families, and then also encourage them to sort of collaborate and kind of cross-pollinate with other families who are experiencing similar circumstances. Okay, and then the upper floors of that as well. So again, I wasn't looking to create a building that was going to stand out like crazy from the street. I wanted it to be very much kind of flat and representative of similar neighborhood street facades. But once we got inside the site, I really wanted to start incorporating elements of landscape. Unfortunately, I'm not a landscape architect. I probably should have taken a class to prepare for this, but it was important for me to really introduce elements of green. A lot of times when you're working with system impacted people, there's concerns of mental health, especially for people who have been formerly put into solitary confinement. And so green space, water, open air is really helpful in terms of sort of rehabilitating their mental wellness. And so creating an amphitheater for performances and celebration. To create a multi-purpose room for weddings or parties, community meetings. One of the things when I talk to residents that lived in the neighborhood, it's like, we don't have a place for that. Like we go to the high school. It's like, you have a wedding at the high school gymnasium. But so to create spaces that would absorb like a lot of people for celebration, would empower the residents to have fun, enjoy their lives just like everybody else. For reference, that's Beyonce and Blue Ivy right there. I actually had to cut out all the Black people individually because I'm sure some of you are aware when you go onto the Entourage websites, it's predominantly white people. So a little exercise for me. And then restorative justice, which is a 3-part model of community, victim, and the offender, or those who have been accused. It's actually an indigenous practice that is being increasingly used in the justice system. One thing I should mention is that most people, when they go into jail or prison, recidivize, which means to go in and out of prison. Their chance of doing that is 75% after 5 years, which is insane, because it's super expensive to go to prison or jail for taxpayers. It takes a lot of time for that person to go through their sentence, and then to have to kind of go back in that cycle is just it's just awful. And so restorative justice has been explored a lot more as of late and tends to have recidivism rates of 20 to 30% after 5 years. And it's a lot more successful also in sort of repairing the harm between the victim, the person who's been accused of the crime, and the community as well. So I created a few different spaces for restorative justice within the site that are kind of nested within the little arms of the residential areas. Each one can absorb anywhere, I think, between about 6 to 30, 40 different participants. And it's really important that you sit in a radial organization. And it was also important to me to make sure to integrate elements of water and plants and open air to create spaces that felt warm and that felt loving and accepting of those crimes that were committed, and also make sure people are exploring their wellness. So the labyrinth, the hilltop, this is probably one of my favorites. And the idea for this one was to be able to sit overlooking a tree canopy. Walls. One thing I really want to do is create a gallery-like space with one of the restorative justice circles, that people who otherwise would use some of the walls for graffiti could be encouraged to do some of their street art in here. And that would have a dual purpose for that. Flower field. One thing that I would hear for some of the women that I would talk to when doing the research was that they wanted to see flowers, or they remembered seeing flowers in their grandparents' backyard. And that's something I remember in my grandparents' backyard, and just the imagery of something in bloom in an environment that otherwise that lacks that. And so creating those spaces. And then the last thing I want to talk about briefly is the LA River Master Plan, which is a project I'm working on right now in my office, and specifically the homelessness related goals. Just to define the vulnerability in this project, the person's experiencing homelessness. So it's an individual who is living in substandard housing or lacks housing tenure. A lot of times we think of homelessness as someone who's living on a cardboard box, but it's like so much more beyond that. It could be the family who's in and out of motels on the weekends, who's kind of couch surfing between relatives' homes, the person who lives in an RV full time. But yeah, that's that. To give you an overview of the LA River, it's 51 miles long and runs through 17 different municipalities. The reason why I bring up the length of this is that it means it cuts through so many different elements of LA County and types of LA County, politically, population-wise, in terms of the ecology. And so it creates a bunch of different variables in terms of how we create solutions for those different mile markers. Just a view of what that looks like across the county. The thing about doing a master plan with 17 different cities means that you're meeting people a lot and you're trying to talk to a lot of different interests. And the result of that was a pretty robust community engagement, which was about 40 different community meetings, as well as youth events and indigenous groups or events. And we went to other people's events and presented the project. It was a pretty amazing opportunity to talk to a lot of different swaths of the city and the county. The team has put together 9 different goals, and the goals range from water needs and water quality to ecology, open space, parks, and then so the people goals, which are housing, affordable housing, homelessness, arts and culture, education. And for every goal that we focused on, we created a robust series of data sets and then aggregated some of the data sets to really showcase areas of greatest need. So these read as heat maps. The darker the area, the darker the red, the more need that area has relative to that particular goal. If you go on the master plan's website, you'll see like hundreds and hundreds of data sets. These are kind of like the 9 key data sets for those. And for homelessness and housing, that's what I'm going to focus on quickly right now. The reason why homelessness specifically became even an element of the master plan in the first place was that we asked people at community meetings what their top concern was in terms of visiting the river, and it was safety. When we asked specifically about safety and why they didn't feel safe going to the river, most people answered homelessness. You can attribute some of this to a little bit of NIMBYism, some of it because of hearsay, perceptions of persons experiencing homelessness, but it really kind of caused a bit of pause in our team's response to how we wanted to address it and figure out what the need meant. We did some digging and looked and found out that currently the county has almost 67,000 people experiencing homelessness. Within the LA River right-of-way, so the sort of narrow channel on the outside of the river, there's about 9,000 people who occupy the river on a given day. Occupying the river can mean a few different things. Some people kind of live in these outfall tunnels, which is very dangerous, especially during floodwater or stormwater events rather, because if LA doesn't rain a lot, about 90% of the time it's actually dry, but the other 10% of the time there's water and it's coming really fast and it's channelized into the river. And annually, there tends to be at least a few deaths of people who are experiencing homelessness, who are literally washed into the river and carried out to Long Island, Long Beach. So it's an issue for their safety. It's also an issue for health and public health. There's a lot of people who use the river for sanitation reasons. And so in 2017 and 2018, the river had an outbreak. I mean, people that lived along the river corridor had an outbreak of Hep B, which is very severe, especially when you're talking about really vulnerable people. And so it's important that we find ways for them to have access to sanitation that isn't the river itself. We established a series of steps that we want to use to help address homelessness, starting with outreach, which is already kind of an existing thing within the county between independent nonprofits like PATH. United Way also does a lot of outreach. Also, the county itself has a homelessness outreach effort, as well as the city of LA. Looking at low barrier navigation centers, which are basically trailers or sort of inexpensive structures that have social workers and nonprofits that are stationed along different hot pockets of homelessness. Temporary sanitation stations, which we are currently using, which tends to be like porta potties or school buses that have been turned into showering facilities. They're not really a best practice. They're super expensive to maintain. They're very much stigmatized, don't have a lot of, they're not very great, but they're helpful for right now. Looking at public hygiene facilities, so permanent sanitation facilities that could deal with bathroom and showering, interim housing and interim motel conversion. So converting existing buildings into shelters that are you'd stay in for 3 or 4 months. You have your own single room occupancy and there'd be on-site services. Temporary supportive housing, that's when you actually erect a new structure and you then, it's very similar with interim where you kind of live there for 3 or 4 months before they help get you into more permanent solutions. And then permanent supportive housing, when you are actually housed in more traditional housing and you live there until you leave. No one's pushing you out, but you also have on-site services, drug rehab, mental health, all there for you right there. Sometimes they also have some dining facilities as well. All these things would work with the county-wide coordinated entry system, which basically helps to identify what an individual's needs are relative to what is available. What ends up happening a lot of time, unfortunately, is that people, when they take the coordinated entry system exam, they'll lie about their vulnerabilities and say like, oh, like, do you have an underlying illness? No, I don't. And then deep down inside, they actually have diabetes and high blood pressure. And what ends up happening is that there's priority given to people who have higher vulnerability scores. And so sometimes there's a little kind of a miscalibration of who needs sheltering first. But so working with the county to really understand how these different efforts can kind of plug into that system. And just really quickly, I want to focus on the public hygiene facilities because this is one of the things I thought was relatively creative of our team. We have, as part of a broader river effort, have created a series of pavilions that will go up and down the entire length of the river. The pavilions some of them are just there to provide shade because it's hot in LA, especially during the summer. The river is a very, very light shade of concrete, so it radiates heat like crazy. But we also wanted to create pavilions that had areas for restrooms because everybody has to go. And then near big recreational facilities, such as like soccer pitches or swimming pools, actually have locker rooms, showers, and again, restrooms so that people can store their stuff while they're going to the pool, or they can, if your kid has soccer practice, they don't have to come home stinky, you can ask them to take a shower, it's right there. But there's sort of a dual use for this for people who are experiencing homelessness that may otherwise not have access to a shower in the area. And so we've created all these different configurations of the pavilions, some of which literally will cantilever over the river or kind of stand next to it. And these are just kind of examples of what these can look like. So the rest are tier 2 pavilions, or the ones that just have restrooms in them, very simple modular restrooms that some of which might be self-cleaning, but we are also talking to the county about using a pretty robust maintenance program where you might have on-site maintenance 24/7. For some of you guys who might have been to LA before, if you ever go to like Venice Beach, you might notice that sometimes persons experiencing homelessness live in bathrooms. They're not particularly well maintained. And so you need people to actually be there to help make sure that they're getting cleaned out, that they're being maintained on a daily basis, and what that might look like when it's rendered. And then a tier 3 pavilion, the gathering. So that's the one that's kind of robust. It might have other amenities. It might have a cafe or a multi-purpose room. And that actually having the showers. And I think it is frozen. Okay, there we go. And then lastly, just showing how we've actually gone through and mapped out exactly where every single one of these facilities are. And so the idea is that you basically shouldn't have to go more than 10 minutes to go to the bathroom and no more than 20 minutes to have to take a shower. We've actually have been in communication with the county about doing a pay per shower model for people who are willing to pay to help offset the cost of the maintenance. It's commonly used in places like Sweden. Again, it's kind of the Scandinavian model, but really creating opportunities for people to have opportunities for sanitation, opportunities for them to have shade, something to eat, something to drink, and then also possibilities to work with the different service providers on site and help them get housing as well. And that is it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dana. I think we can all agree that was a really memorable and exciting presentation. I think now we'd like to, Michelle, did you want to take over? Start speaking.
I think it's just time for the, no, don't worry about it. Thank you so much, Dana. That was phenomenal. We're just going to introduce our panelists, student panelists. If you guys could just say your name, your pronouns, and then we'll start to go through the questions. We have some drafted up by panelists already, but we can also start reading them from the chat. But so panelists, can you introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Luz. I'm a third year MArch, and I go by she and her.
Hey.
I'm Sarah. I'm a second year MArch student, and I go by she, her, hers.
Hi, I'm Christopher. I'm a thesis student, and I go by he, him.
Hello, I'm Jai. I'm a third year BArch student, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hello, I'm EJ Maxwell. I'm a fourth year undergrad student, and my pronouns are he, him.
All right, I think that was everyone. So members of the community, please feel free to register any questions in the chat. We're gonna kind of get into a conversation that we have already some questions prepared, but we're gonna check in with the chat every so often, and we'll either give you the opportunity to come up and we'll call on you. You can turn your video on and ask the question, or we can read it out for you if you prefer that. But I think, you know, a nice place to start maybe would be back at the beginning when you were talking, Dana, about your time at school and all these amazing committees that you were involved in, the African American Student Union, the Dean's Diversity Committee. So how did you juggle these interests and responsibilities with your schoolwork? And why was it important for you to be involved in these social initiatives? I think we're all kind of going through some measure of that. So it would be great to hear about your side of that.
Okay. It was not easy to juggle. I joke that I was a full-time student and a part-time activist, which meant like 70 hours in studio and like 30 hours doing Black and Design and African American Student Union and Dean's Diversity. I wasn't getting a lot of sleep at that point, which in retrospect, I should tell everyone, get more sleep. You'll do better for it. And it was just really, really difficult at the time. I really felt compelled to do the work I did because I didn't really see anyone else stepping up to do it. And I wasn't exactly happy with the education and the environment that I was receiving my education. I mean, Harvard is amazing and they do all these amazing, cool projects and we're so innovative, but innovation it doesn't mean anything when I feel like it doesn't speak to my experience or doesn't speak to the community that I love or the people that I love or the values that I hold. And I cannot tell you how many times I was engaging in a project and no one would have an image of a person in it, or the professors wouldn't even mention that this was a historically this neighborhood or historically that neighborhood or economics or any of those factors. And I just felt that it was really setting us up as designers to fail people eventually. Like, we can design amazing innovation, all these things, but it doesn't mean anything if we don't understand the people that we're designing for. And so it was just really important to me to kind of take ownership of that experience, and also through conversations with my friends, like recognizing that they were feeling very similarly about it. I have to admit, like, I am kind of an introvert. I don't know if you can tell that right now, but when I was undergrad, like, I didn't talk to anybody. I wasn't out here, wasn't in these streets, like protesting, wasn't doing anything. I was very much a bookworm and very much focused on what I was doing. And once I got there and I felt so isolated, it was just like, screw being an introvert, like, keep on pushing forward, get out there and talk about it. Because if I'm feeling this way, I know others are going to feel this way, and others to come are going to continue to feel this way.
Absolutely. So panelists, feel free to jump in if you feel like you have a question that relates. Otherwise, I think, EJ, I think you had a question that would really dovetail nicely.
Yes, actually, recently at the Pratt SOA, we've been having a lot of conversations about how to decolonize our pedagogy, sort of from the Eurocentric histories and precedents we are so often taught, to inherent classism in our projects and how they end up being so speculative and not having many proto-clients and thinking of social aspects, even in the way we're starting to conceive these designs. I was wondering if you had similar experiences in your academic career and how you might have coped with them, and how you work to fill in these gaps for yourselves. Yeah. And what sources would you kind of recommend?
Okay. Okay. A lot there. I guess for one, I don't know if there is an architectural education in the United States that isn't Eurocentric and classicist deep down inside. Granted, I've only really had experience with two, but they were both like Eurocentric and classicist deep down inside. And I don't think I realized that as an undergrad. I think I was just like, wow, architecture is amazing. And so I don't think I ever looked up to smell the air and really figure out what that meant until I got to the GSD. And it became really clear to me what we were being taught was really an isolated case of design. And I would love to say, like, here are the 15 books I read that like gave me better exposure to other architecture and design elements. But a lot of what I learned, and again, was self-interest, like on the side, or from what I was being taught, was through traveling, I listened to a ton of podcasts and a lot of design podcasts and podcasts, if anything, but a lot of podcasts was photography and like going places and taking pictures and trying to acknowledge things that I wasn't used to seeing. And as well as just film also was really helpful for places I couldn't go. One thing I think has really been important was through the travel, especially, like, I may not have, especially in grad school, I may not have had 2 nickels to rub together, but I would use like all the money I could to travel. I went on a trip, actually, which was funded by the GSD, thankfully, but I went on a trip to Peru, and seeing Peruvian architecture was like mind-blowing to me. I spent 3 weeks in Japan, and I spent a lot of time looking at what that style of architecture, and like just those 2 trips by themselves, it was like completely crystal clear. Like the limitation of architecture that I was being taught was so narrowly focused. And just talking to people and asking people a lot of questions, sometimes some of which aren't easy to talk about. When I was in school, it was the same time that the National Museum of African American History on the Smithsonian National Mall was being built. And unfortunately, this was before Phil Freelon had passed. We actually, as a student group, had invited him to talk. He actually came multiple times to talk about the progress of the project and the design elements of it. And he talked about like how he was inspired by ironwork in the South that was done by slaves. We talked about how the actual, the form of the building was based off of African like wood sculptures. And so finding references that are either familiar to you or things that you search out, I think was really important to me.
Thank you.
So there are a couple of questions in the chat. Chris Aniftos, would you like to come up and ask your question?
Yeah, hi Dana. Thank you for doing this, by the way. It means a lot to all of us. My question was a little bit about the overall design of your thesis.
Mm-hmm.
I found the organization of the spaces very fascinating, especially with the labyrinth and the hill.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, maybe it's me, but I noticed a sort of ancient sort of organizational pattern like
Mm-hmm.
that of the Mesopotamian ziggurat or the Minoan labyrinth. And I guess I wanted to know if that was something you had in mind and if there were experiential qualities to your users for using sort of organizations like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think I had about 8 different restorative justice spaces, and each one was like a little testament to some part of me or some interest of mine. Mostly because it was like, I have so much space to fill out. Things like 15 acres, go. But the hilltop, for example, is a reference to actually family in some of my lineage. I'm part Native American. My dad is Choctaw and Shawnee. My mom is part Cherokee. And in the Choctaw tribe, there's actually a series of birth mounds, we call them, in which when the tribe was like 1,000, 2,000 years ago, when the tribe was like first sort of establishing its land, they would build these mounds that were kind of stacked up on top of each other, literally filled with bones. Very cool, you should look it up. And that was the way that they established hierarchy in space, but also sort of spiritualness within space. And I did a birthright trip with some family members a few years ago and saw one of the mounds and was just really impressed by like how elevated you can be in space. And like I got that view of the tree canopy, and it was just like these mounds of dirt eventually kind of covered in grass. And it was really empowering to be in that space, and I felt special in that space, and I was like, I feel closer to like whatever power that be. But at the same time, it's also indicative of like reading MLK and thinking about the hilltop and rising and being on top of the hill and looking down on the people and looking down on societies and improving itself. And I think just elevational change can make such an improvement to someone's sort of their own thinking about themselves in relationship to the rest of the world. The labyrinth was a little vestige of a project I was trying to do in undergrad. I really wanted to do research of labyrinths specifically. And I remember doing them as sort of a wellness practice then, in which it's basically a meditation of kind of going around a space and getting to a final destination and entering into that space. And so I wanted that one to be a meditation of sorts, and that you're kind of in between this glass and these really slender columns in the trees around you, and then you end up in the space with everybody else. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if Luz, you want to ask your question next? I feel like maybe like this formal talk will kind of dovetail into it.
Yeah. So my question is, in some academic settings, form-based architecture takes precedence over any other issue, especially social ones. And this leads to creating buildings and environments that aren't welcoming to the BIPOC community or anyone else, really, or people in general, like you said. By not educating designers, we are left with no tools to make informed decisions within our designs. How do you think we can begin to reintroduce these social issues into the designers' education? Just how we've already introduced climate issues in a sense, but social issues even more.
Yeah. I would hate for institutions to start making like, this is your social justice course. Enjoy, kids. It needs to be integrated in every way that we think through design. And it should be immersive as part of the process. Again, I think we are doing ourselves a disservice by like disjointing the social, political, economic factor of life from design. And then all of a sudden you get into the real world and it's like, there are constraints. And so I just think that those constraints should be part of the equation, especially when you talk about a studio class. Like, if you have a real site, especially, that I think the onus is upon the educator and the students to educate themselves on what the site, the implications of that site are. People reside in that site, or they utilize that site, or there's been a history with that site. I just think that it has to be immersed in everything that you do within that project. I'm not saying that everyone needs to do like engagement-based design in every project, but I don't think it's a far cry to say that you shouldn't have engagement in at least one project that you do while you're in school. So I was doing architecture and urban planning, and I cannot tell you how much of a difference having a community engagement component in my studios and planning school made me feel about the work we were doing. And it became very clear that like sometimes shiny, fancy, innovative things aren't what the community cares about at all. And I think sometimes designers, like architects specifically, they need a little bit of a wake-up call to that fact. And I think it humanizes you, and I think it humbles you to understand what people want, to be able to translate those ideas into actual space. And so, yeah, I just think it's important to talk through it in all forms of the education.
Yeah, Dina, we've been talking a lot that's such a great point. We've been talking a lot at Pratt about how to approach communities and sites for speculative interventions, So you did societal simulations, which was speculative. And I wondered, I think especially in academic environments, it can come off as spectatorship or almost voyeurism with no actual benefit to a community. Do you think there is a way to approach these projects and interact with these communities in a more sensitive and mutually beneficial manner? How do you approach it? How do you approach interactions with communities you're designing for in speculative cases?
I think it's critical, even outside of school, that when you're doing work in a community, that the relationship is reciprocal. So it is never like architect swoops in, gives their design, and swoops back out. It needs to be a relationship that is established, and it should be something that people on the other end are also benefiting from, not just the building. When I was doing the project for Newark, I was going to Newark on the weekends, which again was exhausting, but it was really helpful for me to actually talk to people who lived in the neighborhood. My uncle still lives in the area, and he kind of put together a little case group for me, and like I would meet with them maybe once a month to talk through things that they were thinking about. And while they were giving me ideas, I was also kind of giving them feedback from the work I was doing outside of the project on like alternatives to incarceration, on like ways to reintegrate into society. I was like, as I was learning stuff, I was also giving that feedback to them. It was also really important to actually like share the work I did with those people after the fact. And then like in the professional like sense of the word of sort of reciprocality, it's really important that you also use community partners, especially when you're working with really vulnerable groups, and that your community partners are not just NGOs that often are well-meaning people who may not themselves understand the circumstances all that well, may not have lived the circumstances, but also bring people to the table who have lived those circumstances and who are in it. Some people could be out of it, have come out of it, but you want someone who understands that experience. And it's been a huge frustration sometimes into the work I do with the master plan of like, we're talking about people experiencing homelessness, but when was the last time we talked to someone who's experiencing homelessness? And that took a little while for the client and for other people to kind of grasp an idea, like grasp onto, but the work benefited so much more once we started having those conversations. And it makes it more real. If you can say that this is what the person who's going to use this, or this is the person who's going to be affected by this, is going to most benefit by, or benefit by more than some other solutions, the client or the person who's going to be financing it down the road are going to be that much more invested in the project. Even if the ideas come across as crazy, because when we presented the idea of like showers around the river, they were like, no. But now they're all for it.
Thank you.
So I have a question from Nella Schools, who unfortunately had to sign off, but so I'm going to read their question. Were you able to get feedback? Actually, you just leave it. It's okay. I'll read it from the...
Sorry, no, I put it back.
Okay, sorry about that. Were you able to get feedback on your thesis design from anyone in the prison system, either as a client or employee? If so, were there things that they thought would be more or less effective and possible? Were you able to get feedback on your thesis design from anyone involved? Oh, sorry, is that repeated? Yeah, that's all.
Okay. So when I was in school, no. But like I presented my thesis and was like out the door the next day. So basically though, once I moved to LA, I started getting more involved with prison abolition groups and justice alternative groups. And so one of the organizations that I work with right now is A New Way of Life, which is a women's reentry program in LA. And I've since gotten very close with the founder of that organization, and I've shared the work with her and have talked through her vision of what the alternative is and talked through my vision. I've also worked with an organization called Impact Justice. That's actually how I was able to travel to Norway and Finland last year. They helped pay for me to go and see the Norwegian and Finnish prison system, having talked through my idea. And they're like, your idea is like kind of close to this, but it's a little bit different. And literally sitting with Norwegian Minister of Justice, or like the Deputy Minister of Justice in Norway, and talking through these concepts. And so, but that was more from like a policy perspective than actually like, let's build it. And very helpful. The former planning director for the city of Newark was my thesis prep advisor. And so that helped a lot too. And so there's been some conversations with the city as well. I don't think they're going to be built, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we'll see. But there have been a lot of conversations I've had offline since school.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jai had a great question that would dovetail nicely here.
Yes, hi.
Hey.
Okay, so your project Map the Gap highlights the killings of 3 Black males, and recent events have begun to turn attention towards Black women being victims of police violence as well. Given that architecture has long shaped women's roles in the home and community, how would you explore this socio space that has redefined the Black woman's life, from white women's suffrage and other civil rights movements that were not inclusive of Black women to now? Where is our space and what does it look like?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Well, you can look back to like early modernism where like there was a hyper design of sort of domestic space in architecture, and like the efficiency of the kitchen and the laundry room and the sort of development of dishwasher and laundry machines, all that. But when that was translated into spaces of like Black people specifically, there was a little lost in translation happening, especially when you look at like public housing. And where the kitchen in like the modernist white household was this thing of beauty and success, it was just like an afterthought in public housing. And public housing is one thing, but then there's also just like housing in low-income neighborhoods that is also developer driven, and doesn't necessarily look at efficiency, doesn't look at dignity, it doesn't look at family structures or any of that. And so I think it's important that we look at what that means, but by no means does a woman need to be like relegated to the space of the kitchen or being a housewife or any of that. I mean, it is fine for those who choose that role in their life, but like notions of what a family life at home were missing in Black and brown spaces typically. And so I think it's really important as we move forward, especially as you see a lot of these like post-industrial cities are going through sort of rejuvenation efforts, that we talk about what makes up a home. There's a ton of housing in the world. There isn't a lot of homes. And I think it's important to really think about, like, especially with COVID, like, what does it mean to work from home? What does it mean to be a 2-parent or a single parent household who has to maintain children and work from the home? What is privacy? What is a sense of security? And I just think there's just going to be a pretty radical rethinking of that in general. But with Black Lives Matter and what's been going on as of late, I think it's a really amazing opportunity to look at what that means for Black women, especially. And that there's also this intersectionality of that with incarceration, which like Black women who are then incarcerated, their homes are undercut. And there's a whole other layer of information. But I don't know, I just think that we have to think more creatively, and I think we have to push what it means for different family structures and changing family structures to create spaces of warmth and comfort and security.
Hey, Dana. Thank you again. This has been really awesome. So yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your design process and how the social justice and community engagement aspects of a project bleed into your formal design and your representational techniques.
Okay. Formal design, I think, like I was saying a little bit earlier, I think I tend to like pull like memories of mine and work off of memory. And so it might be like memories of things I've experienced on a day-to-day basis, or memories of things I've seen like while traveling to see certain elements of space. And so my formal design work is super variable across a lot of my work. There's sometimes when I'm like super into curves and it's like the flavor of the week type of thing. I tend to be a little bit more classical and like rectilinear in what I design. But I think that's actually out of conversations I've had with developers, like affordable housing developers in previous work about just like efficiency of cost, and that like if you can make a beautiful box and you've done a job right, and that you don't need curves to like design beautiful spaces. And so I think sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge to myself to not use curves or splines in the drawings that I'm doing. And then in terms of representation, I think I try to work off of the sentiments of the people I talk to that relate to the work. And so like with the work for societal simulations, my thesis, I really kind of pulled on this notion of dawn and creating the new day. And so I really kind of want to work within that mood, a little bit muted and like, it's not super light out yet, but you're gonna get there. It's gonna be bright soon. Because that's kind of the sentiment when I was talking to people, like that they describe their lives, but it's also the way that they kind of describe like what it meant to get out. Like you're not quite there yet, but you're almost there. Whereas like some of my projects, I might use like acid colors. It really depends. I really like color. I'm wearing black right now, so you may not tell, but I think it's important to also integrate color in design because the world isn't monochrome. And color is beautiful. And so I think it's important when you can to do that, but also create spaces for other people to impose the colors that they like, or the shapes or the patterns that they like as well. I think it's a little unnecessary for architects to be too prescriptive in that. So trying to find the balance between the two.
Do any of our panelists want to ask one of their questions? I think, Chris, you haven't asked anything yet. Feel free.
Sure. You kind of talked about this earlier in your presentation, but kind of what I'm interested in is like how your activism and how your kind of role as an architect and a designer kind of overlap, and how, like, I know you've kind of discussed this, that's kind of the point, but you talked about like in college that, you know, you were working 100 hours, 70 of them in the studio and 30 of them in as an activist, and how even today did those two interact? You know, how do you deal with these kind of back and forth pulls?
Mm-hmm. I want to say when I first started looking, I like to think of like, I want to have a moral compass of platinum one day. Like, I just want to like do right by the world. And when I first kind of came up with this reconciliation of mine, that was just like, oh wait, I'm doing architecture, capital A architecture, and a little bit of planning stuff. And then I have these moral values. How do I merge them together? And so they did kind of start pretty disjointed, where it's like, okay, I'm going to these protests, but then I have studio. And it was hard to kind of merge them together. And then one day I just sort of like, you know, have you read this random statistic? And just like started inserting fun facts into my presentations, somewhat to like disrupt the conversation of studio. And sometimes it wasn't appreciated by faculty, but it's okay. You make mistakes sometimes. And the more I did it, the more it kind of became me in the way that I designed. And I was still doing that stuff on the side, but the things I was doing on the side began to inform what I was doing in the studio. Once I got to the workplace, I made it very clear from day one. I was like, I'm not trying to design for billionaires. I have these values. My values are important to me, and I want to make sure I use those values. which again, may get some pushback. But once they saw that having that value system brought value to the projects, then it was like, okay, what do you think, value system? Like, come to us with these ideas, come to this with these statistics, and start to integrate that research into the work itself. The relationship I have with Susan Burton was actually through my office. And they're like, Dana, we know this random woman, you should talk to her. And so it's awesome because like I have that professionally relationship with her. And then after work, I can like go by one of her houses and like meet with the women that she works with. I can go to like their parties or their house openings or any of those things. And I have that relationship with both work and outside. But it wasn't easy to navigate at first. It was really messy. I felt like at first, like I was kind of falling behind at work, or I felt like I wasn't present enough when I was going to events or meetings. But then I think I got in the hang of it, and especially the older I get and like the more I matured, I think it just kind of came more natural. So I think at this point it's pretty interwoven. And my team at work is always pretty aware when I'm not feeling like my moral compass is like rocking. It's like, oh, what's going on? What's going on? And I'll just be like, I have a feeling, guys. It's a feeling. I'm gonna like tell you what I feel. And what I'm starting to notice is some of the people around me are using their intuition and their gut a little bit more to, I think, say something when something doesn't quite feel right to them. And that's really beautiful to watch, honestly.
So inspirational.
Yeah, I think also Emmett Sutton might have a question that's like sort of like right as what you were just speaking to, like in the office. I don't know if they want to read it.
Yeah, it is super related to what you just said. It's kind of lucky, I guess. But yeah, I guess I was wondering because you talked about facing some friction at GSD for the 100 Faces installation from like a few students. But I'm wondering if at Gary you felt like supported in your activism, or you've faced similar friction. But it sounds like you've been really supported, so it's amazing.
Yeah, again, it's not easy. So I would have to definitely say when I first got there, they're like, who is this chick? And her like feel-goodness going on. And it was a lot of vulnerable conversations that I had to have with different partners and seniors in the office. A lot of which would be me like talking about my story and like why it's important to me, or talking about people I met in the neighborhoods that I've been talking about and then share their story, like no names or anything, but because I don't think they saw the value in it, or they don't think that way. Like, again, architecture is predominantly white. My office is predominantly white. And I think that there are certain things that they just don't see on a day-to-day basis in their own life or their own experience. And I can't tell you how many like Ta-Nehisi Coates articles I have sent to people in the office. Like anytime I get moved, and we move like our bays quite a bit, like once every 6 months. Anytime I move, the people on either side of me get Ta-Nehisi Coates articles. I'm like, you said something problematic, you're getting an article. You said something problematic, you're getting an article. And so I feel like sometimes I end up doing a little bit of educating across levels, like people who are entry level right out of school. Sometimes it might be a partner. I'm like, I'm going to have to call you out on that. But again, it puts you in a place of vulnerability. People aren't necessarily super happy to be called out at first, or they don't want to be questioned at first. But I think in me being super, super vulnerable about my own experience and sharing others' experiences, I think they see the value of it. It also helps that like I've since subsequently like gotten Frank on board, and it's really, once he got on board, it's hard for anyone else not to.
Sarah, I think your question would really be great at this moment.
Yeah. So I was wondering, I guess kind of a twofold question. So why did you decide to go into Gary Partners originally, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of working at a firm like that, especially for the type of work that you're interested in relating to social activism? And I was also wondering if you feel like, I guess you've kind of spoken about this and you said it's been difficult, but how you've really found a sense of expression and agency in your work while working at such a large firm.
Yeah. So for a little bit of backstory, I never thought I would go to like a capital A architect office before, and like wasn't on my radar. I wasn't interested. Which Frank hates being called Starchitect, hates it. But in 2015, so I started the GSD in 2012, and I graduated in 2017. In 2015, the university does this big arts festival every year where they invite like artists from around the world, and there's all these performances and movies and showings. And then they do a service or ceremony at the very end of it where they give a Lifetime Achievement Award to one lucky winner in the world. And 2015, Frank Gehry was the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award. And the university selects a student or two per university. There's 13 at Harvard. So between like 15 to 25 kids every year go to the ceremony. And then there's a reception and dinner that follows. I was selected to go in part because of the relationship I built with the dean. He was like, "You would be good to meet him." Unfortunately, it was the day before my final review, so it was just like, oh, this is the worst timing possible. It's the worst timing possible, but I'll go. And after the award ceremony, Frank and his wife Berta were sitting on a couch by themselves for a while, and I kept on circling the room like, no one's talking to them. I don't know what's going on. He won this Lifetime Achievement Award. And I literally just sat down next to him and struck up a conversation, and he's like, okay, you have like cojones, like what are you doing over here? And basically I talked about how I was an architect, but also studying urban planning. And he admitted that he had studied urban planning at the GSD and dropped out for a litany of reasons. But he said that, he's like, do you need a job? I'm like, not for 2 more years, but I will in 2 years. And I got his phone number and was told, just give him a call, come into the office, see the office. And a year later, I was visiting a friend in LA, and I went by the office for a tour and got a lot more than a tour. I got a mouthful about the LA River and that they were looking for interdisciplinary designers to come on the project. And a year after that, I joined the firm. I also realized that Frank at the time was like 86, and I really wanted to take advantage of him, not him, but I want to take advantage of the opportunity because he is amazing. And I don't know, I didn't know how long he would be at the office. Thankfully, he's 91 now, and he still comes to work 6 days a week, is super active in the practice. And the office is about 200 people across the board, and kind of integrating my design voice at first is not easy. Frank is the designer, so like you have to kind of go to the top to have your thoughts integrated. But I think it's a matter of being vulnerable and talking through your ideas. If you are your best salesperson, and so like if you can rationalize your ideas and communicate them clearly to others, then like that helps you in the long run. And so sometimes I would like put together a presentation of just my thoughts to present to the partner and Frank. Because if you just kind of say it off the cuff, it may not resonate enough, or pull them aside to talk to them separately. But it was important, I think, to really clearly articulate what I was thinking so that it wasn't just sort of like an in the moment thought, and to show that like it was well intentioned, it was well thought through, and it was relevant to like the ideas that we were working on as a project.
EJ, I think you had a great question about identity in the workplace. And I think that would really, since you're talking about the workplace, I think that would be a great next question.
Yeah, I kind of had a question about how to cultivate a more significant place and voice for underrepresented identities in the design fields, all of them. I think more of a segue for myself is kind of, I think a lot about my interest in the field, other than like kind of decolonizing the curriculum in the workplace. Also, bringing back the agencies of space making and design to people in our community. So not just professionally, but how do we pique people's interest in social justice design projects, for lack of better words?
I think sometimes I feel like you have to talk to people's purse strings, which is unfortunate. But so like with my thesis, one of the things that I kept on doing, because it wasn't resonating at first with the school and they weren't particularly enthusiastic that I was talking about incarceration, was to talk about like how for the long term it was a much more cost-effective value proposition, and how the cost-effective value proposition also aligned with a value proposition that we should have socially speaking. And so I think sometimes when you might be around more like fiscally conservative people, like that's a really effective method of kind of breaking through the ice a little bit. In terms of design as a whole and the longevity and sort of space for like BIPOC people, I think that we all, especially like Black and brown designers, are going to have to take a much greater initiative to expose younger people to design. There is an extremely high sort of dropout rate over time through the professionalization of an individual in design, specifically for Black and brown people. So like, let's say 5% of architecture students are in undergrad that are Black. By graduate school, it's 2.5%. By the time they get to licensure, it's like 1.5 or 2%. And so there's all these sort of hurdles that people aren't necessarily aware of, or they're not supported through. But the fact that we're starting at 5%, but we're closer to, 14, 15, 16% of the national population, that's already the issue. And so we need to get that number to be more representational of where we are nationally, which means that there might need to be more outreach to children. And so like I, for example, on the side, another like activism effort of mine is I co-founded an organization called Echo Studios, and we work with kids in Linwood, Southgate, Inglewood, and Compton to do architectural education, design education for kids. We also do some like planning work as well. And a lot of these kids are kids who have dropped out of high school and they're in a career alternative program for construction. And so our pitch basically is that like, yes, it's great if they want to be a plumber. Yes, it's great if they want to be an electrician or a general contractor. But if they're interested in the design field, maybe they might be interested in architecture. They might be interested in landscape architecture. Let's just like pull a few from your program that you think might have that interest, and let's try to see if we can incubate them to apply to programs later. We started the organization in 2018, so like it's really fresh, 2 years ago, but we just recently received our 501c3 status, 401c3. And we now have our first kid who just finished his program, is now in community college doing design classes. And his goal is that in 2 years, he'll apply into a 4-year college for architecture. And this is a kid who, again, dropped out of high school and is now taking classes, and he's learning Rhino, and he's learning like coding and all these other things. And he's super excited, but it took one person or two people to kind of reach out to him and say that this is an opportunity for you, and it's an option, and it's a valuable option. But it's really, it's not easy. It's time consuming. We might get 8 kids in a session or 20 kids in a session. And it sometimes feels like it's so much work, and maybe it's not that much payoff, but when you're talking about 1.5 or 2% down the road, maybe those 20 kids make a huge difference. And like, I got my license in architecture last year, and I was the 455th Black woman in the history of the country to get my license. In history, 455. Like, I went to fewer, like the GSD, that's half of the GSD, and that's in history. So I don't know. I think that if you have more people popping up with classes, you go to high schools and you talk to students, you get them interested in it, I think it'll make a huge difference ultimately. You may not see the numbers skyrocket next week for licensure, but you'll see them go up in 10 years, 15 years. So again, it's a long haul.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question if no one else has the next one. Like, it's sort of going off of what you're talking about with this like idea of like, certification and credentials, like your multiple degrees. I'm just wondering like how they've like impacted your career trajectory, like your ability to design and build, like how they've like legitimized like how people treat you, and like, yeah, how they like their perspective of you like as a professional like throughout your career so far.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a household where the mantra for like education was that you have to work twice as hard because you're Black to be legitimized in the same space as your white counterparts. So I never thought about like, I want to be an architect, so I'm just going to go get architecture. It was like, I'm going to be an architect, but I want to ready myself with so much more so that when I get to the table, I'm legitimized and no one's thinking about my race, which may or may not be the case. And so when I was applying to grad school, I knew I wanted to be an architect. That was very clear to me. but I knew I wanted to also understand social factors. I wanted to understand economics and financing and development skills, and I wanted to understand policy. So that's why I applied to the urban planning department. I didn't want to be an urban planner at all. I just wanted to understand urban planning. And so when I applied to the program, my first sentence in my essay was along the lines of, I don't want to be an urban planner, but and I explained, like, I want to be an architect, but I want to be able to answer the questions that the planners have for me. I want to be able to go to a design review board and understand the things that are coming my way and to be able to contribute back to that. Since coming out of that program, I've since kind of realized I do enjoy planning, and I like kind of wearing the hat of planner and architect. So I do. But the next goal then became licensure. And it was really important to me to get my license because I spent 5 years in grad school. So I might as well like legitimize myself that much further with my architecture license. And, you know, like a lot of people aren't necessarily pulling for that professionally. I mean, even though my firm is supportive of licensure, as a whole, there's kind of like a weird thing about it where like a lot of people aren't really supportive of it. But to be called an architect, which was important to me, it was important to finish my license. The same is true with urban planner now, and I didn't realize that was going to be the case, but I will go through that once COVID is over and I can actually take the exam. But it was really important for me to have that credential. And I think it gives people a little bit more pause when I step in the room to be able to say like, oh, I have an AIA after my name, or like I've been licensed for 4 years, but whatever by that point. Sometimes it's funny to kind of, as I work a lot with developers, many of whom are white men, that when I walk in the room, they might ask me for a cup of coffee and then to turn around and give them the presentation and be like, I'm the architect here, like ask that person for coffee. And so to kind of have that to legitimize myself, I think has been really good. I don't necessarily need those credentials to do the work that I'm doing, but I think it helps to propel the work that I'm doing forward as well.
Thank you.
Speaking of COVID, I think Luz had a question that will tie in there.
Yeah. So you have worked with unhoused populations in the past. How has COVID-19 redefined the scope of this work? And have you started exploring new projects to address this even more prevalent crisis during a pandemic?
Mm-hmm. So the main way that COVID-19 has affected the work that I'm doing is that the master plan work is still ongoing. We were supposed to, actually today's the 29th, right? We were actually supposed to release the public draft today, but it got pushed a few weeks, the 19th of October. I'm gonna hold on to that. But right when COVID started, we were still kind of finalizing the language specifically around the affordable housing and homelessness goals. And we started working with the county, kind of even as like a side project of the master plan, to talk through issues of homelessness, specifically as people are affected by COVID-19 and the vulnerabilities they have, like being on a street or in an RV or in close confines with other people. And so we've been working with groups on Project Roomkey, which is looking at interim motel conversion, which the county wasn't really that aware of prior to the master plan, but because of our pushback in the master plan, that became part of that strategy to actually get people housed, especially during the pandemic, especially those who are elderly or have underlying health conditions, to get them off the street and to make sure that they have a place that's sanitary and safe. And then also we have integrated some new strategies in, like, so I showed you that timeline. Like there's a whole bunch of sub strategies within that timeline. And so actually creating new vocabulary within the master plan that does kind of talk about the vulnerabilities that otherwise wouldn't be expressed had it not been a pandemic. I know like other parts of our office are doing things where they're looking at like alternative office configurations, because we work a lot with Facebook, and we're doing a building right now that's under construction, but that's not so much of what I'm doing in the office, but yeah.
We have another question in the chat. Paul, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. I really liked the work that you did along the LA River, and it just reminded me of a lot of the communities. I don't know Los Angeles specifically, but I know many communities along industrial riverfronts face higher levels of pollution, things like that. I just wanted to know if there's any environmental justice aspects to the work you've done so far. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I was mentioning the community engagement process, we actually have a series of a steering committee. And so there's about 41 partner agencies and nonprofits that are part of that steering committee, including groups like East Yard's Communities for Environmental Justice, kind of a mouthful. We call it East Yard. And they're a community group that literally just focuses on the I-710, so one major highway that cuts through LA County, and how the air pollution from that particular highway affects the communities on either side of it. And so we've been working with them to look through the tools that they were using for the highway, for how we can look at the river corridor similarly about the different communities on either side. We really also pull a lot from statewide and countywide policies that look at water safety and water quality. And so a lot of the water in the river right now is water runoff, but there's also daily outpour from like businesses that aren't supposed to be outpouring into the river, and they kind of do it illegally. And so we've been looking a lot at samples of water and how we can work with those organizations that are kind of doing the water outpour, as well as how to capture some of the runoff that has like the gas and the chemicals and all the stuff from going into the ocean ultimately, because it does harm the ecology of the ocean, which is south of the river. Yeah, and then we also look a lot at materiality, like for the pavilions and the habitat species that we're looking at planting along the river. There's a lot of conversation about what brings good like oxygen. I'm not a landscape architect, so apologies, but there's also a lot of stuff along those lines. And then for materialities, looking at things that are sustainable or very much in line with the sort of the Cal EPA standards, and then looking at even better practices that are kind of federally recognized as best practices for outside spaces, especially. I can put in the chat box the master plan website. There's like a ton of information in there, so I recommend
that would be great
to look there.
Just to
and then, oh, sorry.
Just to add really quick, I mean, you don't have to say, you know, you're not a landscape architect. You are actually doing way better than any landscape architect back out there. Background in landscape architecture too. So you're doing great with that.
We have landscape architects, Lori Olin's office on the project, and they're like amazing and so thoughtful. And so whenever there's like a plant thing, I'm always just like, not me, I don't know what they're talking about. It's like I didn't take a single landscape class in grad school, and I'm like, that was the one thing I probably should have studied at one point.
So I think we have a question from Jai. Would you like to ask that, Jai?
Yes. Give me a moment. My internet has been messing up a little bit.
Nope.
No worries.
No problem.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, so my next question would be, have you ever considered tackling the process backwards? Like, I know you were talking about, you know, moving from the issue to it like ending up being rehabilitation, but I was wondering if you look at rehabilitation and then like start from like top bottom, and what kind of role can architecture have in ending over policing and lowering incarceration rates? Mm-hmm. Also, can we dismantle the system by building wellness spaces, and what completes a wellness space, do you think?
Okay, I'm going to try to come back to your first question because I have to think about that one a little bit more. In terms of what architects can do to dismantle police and over policing and police brutality, I think everybody, not just architects, like everybody has a responsibility to address that. I think that if you sense or see or bear witness to an injustice, I think as a member of society, I think the onus is upon us to take action. And I think action looks like a whole litany of options. It can be from going to a rally or a protest to showing up at a community meeting where you articulate your thoughts to your local politicians. It can mean writing your senators or your congressmen about things, that your ideas or your concerns. It can also just mean voting. For those of you who are over 18, which I assume is most of you, you should all be voting this year. Sorry if you can't, but like if you can vote, you should vote. And also really paying attention. I feel like I have so many friends in design who never know what's going on in the day-to-day news cycle. And I'm not saying to like watch CNN all day, every day, but you should at least know, generally speaking, what is going on in society around you. One thing, if anyone's from California or specifically LA County, they should be aware of Measure J. Measure J is a bond measure right now that's going out in the county that will be on the ballot this November. And it's an alternatives to incarceration measure, and also looking at Black and brown businesses and youth programming and housing. And basically the idea is that it wants to take 10% of tax revenue and put it towards those measures. It is the biggest measure of its kind. It would be the first type of policy of its kind nationally. It is a huge, huge deal. Even if you don't live in LA County, you can still donate to Measure J. Like, if this thing passes, it would really be one of the most progressive pieces of legislation to go through in a long time. The reason why Measure J is something I'm actually focusing on right now, though, is because in LA County, they were supposed to be rebuilding the Men's Central Jail, which was a jail that houses about 5,000 to 6,000 people on a day-to-day basis. Men's Central Jail is essentially a mental health facility. It is about 75 to 80% of its day-to-day population are mental health patients. The county is actually the largest mental health care provider in the country in terms of dollars spent on mental health care, in terms of the drug use, in terms of counseling and therapy. And so the county had approved building this new spectacular jail for like $2 billion, which is a lot of money and a lot of taxpayer money. And through activism and protest and other ideas, the county stopped its own contract, canceled the contract, threw it out, and said, we need to utilize that money for better, recognizing that 75% of the day-to-day population are mental health patients. So like, if that's the case, like, why are they in jail? They shouldn't be there. They need to be treated for the underlying conditions that brought them there in the first place. And so that kind of tailspinned into Measure J, and there's a whole bunch of other really cool things that are happening right now in the county. So like, fingers crossed, Measure J goes through in November. But I think some of those ideas did come from people who are like us, by just saying there is an alternative. Wait, there's better ways you can spend your $2 billion. And just think about $2 billion to house like 5,000 people is absurd. Like, you could probably house like 10,000 people in regular houses for $2 billion. So I think it's just really important to understand what's going on around you. If there's an issue that you find that is pressing, to actually get involved. In terms of your first question, though, I don't think I thought of it that way. I think for me personally, it's really important to really understand and do a lot of research before I engage a project. And so I didn't tell you guys, but when I was doing my thesis, I actually spent an entire semester of coursework prior to the thesis outside of the architecture school. So I took a class in the law school, I took a class in the sociology department, I took a education school class on alternatives, to the school to prison pipeline. I took a class in the art school on justice movements in art movements and how they collaborate with one another and they kind of coalesce. And it was really important for me to understand the issue before tackling it, because I felt like it would be disingenuous of me to talk about something with such sensitivity. And I didn't want to say, like, I'm the expert in the room and actually not know anything about it. And one thing for me that is really important is to kind of humble myself and say, I don't know what I don't know, and don't pretend to know what I don't know. And so if you have the opportunity to educate yourself in a certain area, then like, by all means, you should take it, because it will make you that much more or better equipped to answer the questions and to actually like tackle the design problem in the end. But maybe I should try your idea. I don't know. I haven't thought of it that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that. Also, Chris put the link into the Yes to J, so everyone should go click on that and see what it's about. I have one more question. I don't see any other in the chat, but given that architecture is such like a high pressure field, like academia to personal life, like there's a lot of stressors and everything, and we don't often talk about failure and its effects on architect and just people and personal growth, which is like another thing that we kind of don't tend to focus on. So what are some memorable failures that you've had, and how have you reacted and coped with them?
Yeah, everybody fails at some point. I'm not saying like fail a class, but everyone fails at something at some point. I think one of the ones for me that's been kind of notable was I had this internship, I think between my second and third year in grad school. I was really excited to work for this firm, and they specialize in something that I was really excited to learn about and see up close in person. And I got put on a project that was a skyscraper in India. I don't know if I should say fortunately, but it didn't get built. And part of the brief of the project, it was a residential tower, let me say that first, but part of the brief of the project was that for every 3 bedrooms, you needed to have 1 servant's quarter. And most of the units were 3-bedroom up to 7-bedroom units. So some units had 3 servants' quarter bedrooms. Most of the bedrooms or servants' quarters that we were designing were anywhere from like 6 to 7, 6 by 8, 6 by 9. So I'm like, oh, 1 foot wider than a prison cell. That's cute. And then the other thing that really bothered me was that none of the servants' rooms looked outside. It all sat aligned against a central ventilation shaft. So you couldn't get a view of like a tree or a bird, a ventilation shaft. They also weren't allowed to be on the same floor as the people that they were serving. So they were on half-floor steps, which I was just like, what? And so the people that served you were half floor below you. It's like all sorts of crazy. And I remember approaching my partner at the time being like, oh, this is a moment. Like, I'm not feeling this. My little moral compass is taking the wrong way. And they basically said, like, you're an intern, get back to it. And I didn't push back anymore. And to me, that was probably the most like, I don't know, I was just distraught about it. Like, I was like, couldn't sleep. And then ultimately they like lost financing. I mean, the client lost financing, wasn't able to actually build the project. But all I could think about was like, I'm about to make like several hundred, if not 1,000 people's lives miserable. Like I'm contributing to someone else's misery. And I know they're not gonna be well paid. And I know they're not gonna be treated well. And so that was really difficult. And it took like, I didn't find out for another year that the project wasn't gonna be built. And I was just like, that's great. I wasn't mad about it. And I think that was a really good lesson to me that if I really don't believe in something, I shouldn't take part in it. And that if you don't believe in something and you don't want to take part in it, maybe you can also push back. And like, I don't really think that client would have a tolerance for pushback, but maybe our office at the time, the office I was working for at the time, like maybe they didn't need to do the project in the first place. And I just think that architects have a lot of agency to push back a lot more. And they should. If you don't believe in it, don't design it. I know that there's been like a petition going around for years about architects not designing prisons. And the petition was since revised to say architects shouldn't design spaces of torture. So no solitary confinement and no execution chambers, because we still have the death sentence in the United States. I don't believe in designing prisons. I don't ever want to design a real prison. And I don't want to design any space of torture. If I was ever asked to be put in that position, I would either say, we're not doing the project, or like, I don't need to be part of this team anymore. And I just think you have to understand where your values lie and then actually integrate your values into the work that you're doing, especially as you move forward professionally. Oh, and one other thing, going back to sort of like balancing things in your school and like dealing with the sort of balance, I cannot articulate enough how important sleep is. Because I did like the first 2 years of not sleeping, it wasn't worth it. It's totally not worth it. Like that extra section, no one's gonna pay attention to it. If any professors are on, I apologize. But no one's really gonna pay attention to that extra section. No one's gonna pay attention to that, like those extra like 5 trees you added in the rendering with a little shadow at the bottom. Like there's a diminishing return at some point of your day. You're gonna hit it. Don't go past the point of diminishing returns. Like, it is so important to get sleep. It's so important to understand that like you and your work will be better off for like, that rest that you have. Like sleep is an anatomical function that you actually need to have. And so like if you can cut yourself off so you at least get like 5 hours a night, you definitely should. And even like with my performance at the school, like I was like, I mean, we had pass fail system and like high pass. but I was just a pass girl all the way through first 2 years. And the day that I was like, I'm done with this, like I'm tired all the time, I'm gonna get some sleep, my performance in the school like skyrocketed with my sleep quality. So sleep.
That is so valuable. Thank you so much. I think that's something we all need to hear. We're all struggling with that. And on that note of sleep, I would like to see if there's any other last questions, comments, anything from the audience or from our panelists.
Yeah, we are approaching the 2-hour limit. We have 7 minutes.
And thank you so much, Dana, for being patient with us. And thank you to everyone who's still here watching.
Yeah, this is a super side note question, but I love your Davis Coltrane pop art in your background. I just kind of processed it. Do you know who the artist is?
Oh, it's actually my partner's. I would have to ask. The initials are JCMJ. Maybe you can hear me. You can tell me. He might be on a call too. Okay, if I find out, I'll either email you guys or I'll let you know. But JCMJ.
Nice. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, Dana, thank you so much. It's been an honor. It's been such an engaging, I mean, I don't feel like 2 hours has passed. I don't know about you guys. But thank you, Dana. And thank you so much to everyone who came. Thank you to the panelists. You guys are amazing. Thank you to my co-host or co-moderator, Michelle. And thank you to Pratt Futures. Thank you to Gaudet. And everyone who helped organize, but especially Dana. Thank you.
Yeah, we cannot thank you enough. Like so much phenomenal effort and like through everything. Thank you.
Thank you times. Thank you.
Thank you so
Have a great night, everyone, and get some sleep.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.